It took me so much longer than I think it should have to figure out how the hell I was going to get financially free outside of my job, outside of super, and outside of my business. But about 3.5 years ago, after reading Phil Anderson's book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, I just had this oh my God moment, and I sat down for about 2 hours with my wife and we mapped out exactly how we were going to do it based on our position, our risk profile, and what we were prepared to trade. Now, 3.5 years down the line, I am so grateful to say that I've moved on from the properties that weren't serving me getting there, and I've set up a portfolio, or by the end of the year, I'll have a portfolio that now just needs me to pay off the debt to achieve my lifelong goal, or the goal that I've had since the time I was about 19 after visiting Europe with the boys and hanging out with a bunch of guys that were a bit older than me, sort of my age now, that were financially free, that had choices, and that were living their lives on their terms. In today's video, I wanted to explain how you can take some of the ideas that I have or that I've developed with Ryan from On Property and figure out a way to get financially free in the future. And there are two very, very distinct strategies that I wanted to discuss today. One of them is a bit of a slower burn. It's for those of you that have a lower risk profile. And then there's a slightly faster way, which requires you to go into a little bit more debt and use a bit more leverage, but might help you get there a little bit faster. But what I wanted to say is there's absolutely no quick fix when it comes to achieving financial freedom. It is going to take time. And so just take the pressure off yourself, breathe, relax, enjoy the journey, and just trust that if you set the right intention, you have the right vision, you have the right goal, and you know where you want to be, then you identify clearly where you are today as well as a plan to get there, and just jump in and trust the process, and that there are going to be bumps and bruises on the way, that it is going to be a bit stressful at different times on the journey, that all sorts of things are going to come up during that journey, but you will get there because the plan will work for you. Then this is going to be a beautiful 15 to 20 years of your life. The ideas that I have are very, very, very similar. The first one is effectively buying 2 houses and adding 2 secondary dwellings. The second idea isn't too much different, and I'll break them both down in a moment, is to buy 2 houses with 2 secondary dwellings. But in the slightly faster way, we then go out and we buy a completely different type of third property with the sole intention to buy that at the right time, to make the most money that you can over a 10 or 15 year period on it, and then to sell that property after a beautiful renovation for a good profit at the top of the market at that time. Now, the reason why that strategy is a bit faster is because with the first option, you've really got to use the properties plus your own income to pay off the debt, where with the second option, you've got this property which is obviously going to be worth quite a bit more in the future that you can sell, raise a big chunk of cash, and therefore pay off your debt much faster. I've personally gone for this second option, not really knowingly, but that's just how it's panned out. But we've also talked to and helped a lot of clients going through that other option as well. So let's break it down in terms of these two different ideas, which are very, very similar. Now, with the first idea, like I said, there are a range of different steps and stages. Now, the first step is to go, today I am here, and in the future, I would like to have, let's call it $80,000 a year of passive income. If you want to go further than that, cool, buy more properties. And if you don't need that much, then buy less. Like, this is your life, and it's what you're prepared to trade for whatever amount of income that you want in the future, because there is always a trade when you're trying to create something unique in your life, whether that's time. For me, that trade sometimes is my mental health and my physical health. For other people, it's stress, it's pressure on their relationship, it's feeling a bit of overwhelm, it's feeling a bit of uncertainty or a bit of a fogginess in the mind. And that is completely normal and natural. That's just this beautiful thing that we call life that isn't always summertime and perfectly working out for you. Sometimes different seasons do come through too. Effectively, the first stage in that strategy where we buy the 2 houses and build the 2 granny flats is called accumulation. And that's when we go out and we physically buy the assets. Now, it really is 4 steps. First step being buy the first home, building the secondary granny flat or tiny home. Third step is buying the second home, and the 4th step is building the secondary tiny home or granny flat. Now, sounds quite simple, But for some reason, so many people just don't get through the strategy in the time frame that they're supposed to, which is completely, normal, natural, but also very unfortunate. If you're going to start something like this, then I believe it's important to finish it so that you can get to where you want to be and you can achieve what you want to achieve. Now, after you've bought these 2 houses and you've built these 2 tiny homes on it, the next step is what we call consolidation. Now, there's 2 decisions that you can make when you get to consolidation. If you want to go further than just 2 houses, then you continue on by accumulating more and you sort of go back to step 1. Or at that point, you continue doing what you're doing, which is working the way you're working, whether that's your own income, a joint income, or a business, and living the way you're living. Or alternatively, at that stage, once you've bought those properties, you've set them up the right way, there should already be a little bit of passive income if you've done it correctly, and therefore you can actually start to make some meaningful changes in your life. When I'd accumulated the properties that I needed to accumulate to get to my financially free point, I decided that instead of working 60 to 70, sometimes even 80 hours a week like I would make the decision to work a little bit less and maybe work 30 to 35 hours, 4 days a week, giving myself a long weekend. And instead of only taking 2 weeks off per year for holidays at Christmas time, I've started to take lots and lots more mini breaks to keep myself in a better flow state. And instead of hustling and pushing and saving every single dollar at that time, when I decided that I had now enough property to get to where I wanted to be, I started to enjoy my lifestyle, like renovate my home a little bit more. I bought myself a spa and I put a half pipe in my backyard for the kids. Me being the biggest kid in our household by far. Like, my wife and I are always laughing that she's got 4 kids and 2 animals and I'm the 4th baby in the house, the 4th kid. But that's the time when you can start to do stuff. I don't feel guilty anymore by going out there and spending a bit of money on a nice holiday or a nice Airbnb or a nice meal or like a slightly fresher shirt than the $6 shirts that I've been wearing for the last 10 years, because it's kind of like I've accumulated what I needed to and now I want to enjoy the journey. Now, I'm not saying enjoying the journey means spending cash, because I'm still a massive tight ass by nature, but what I'm saying is, you don't have to be putting every single cent like I was for 8 years into my next investment property. That's the beautiful thing about this second phase of, consolidation. It's really at that time that you start to figure out a plan to pay off the debt as well. Now, there's some super simple things that I do. For example, each time I get a tax return associated with the property, instead of spending it, I put that tax return towards paying off debt. Every single dollar that I make that's passive income from my properties, instead of spending it, I put it straight into paying off debt. At that stage in consolidation, I switch my portfolio over to principal and interest, so I'm also paying off the debt that way. Then I continue to commit, because I'm such a saver, to paying off a certain amount of money every single week off my properties in the consolidation phase. And then there's some more advanced things that I'll talk about in the second strategy in a moment. Once you've got through consolidation, which effectively means you paid off these 2 houses and these 2 tiny homes, we then get to the freedom stage. Now, as Ryan from On Property so beautifully puts it, that is where it all begins. But we've talked about that off camera. It's not necessarily where it all begins, because this moment right now is when it starts. This is when you decide to live presently, when you start to enjoy yourself. And don't be like me that just chase this goal to the detriment of sometimes, looking around and smelling the roses. Like, learn from my experience and other people that have gone through what you're embarking on now, and just enjoy the process. Slow down, be present, like do your best, live your best life. But why Ryan says it all begins there is because once you've got a passive income coming in for life, you no longer have to do anything that you don't want to do, and you can choose to 100% show up as the person that you are and achieve what you want to achieve. So I love it. That's what I'm working towards. I'm not financially free yet through my properties, because instead of sitting on 2 properties, I continued to invest a little bit further, which means I've now got more debt. I also decided to take a bit of a deviation to buy my own home with 3 young kids, and therefore I've obviously got to pay off that property as well as these investments to get there. But because I'm enjoying the journey, because I'm learning who I am more and more each day, through things like meditation and yoga and great conversations with people like yourself, you know, it's making me realize that just because I said that I'd do it by this age and I haven't, doesn't mean that I'm a failure. I'm just on my journey, and I think that's what it's all about for all of us. I wanted to share an example of this with someone who's done this exact strategy. Now, his name's Dave. It was actually at the same time that I read that book, Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, that I met Dave and that he came into my life. Now, Dave was actually the guy that I went, holy shit, he's figured it out, because Dave had never earned more than $103,000 per year in his lifetime. He'd also raised a family and had a beautiful home in Sydney. Now, Dave's journey was a bit different to mine, because Dave was sort of happy to take the slow and steady approach, where when I got started, I was rushing around like an absolute idiot. And now I look back, I'm like, man, just chill, take the steady approach, it'll all work out. But Dave effectively bought one house in Sydney 25 years ago, then another one 20 years ago, then another investment 15 years ago. And then about 10 years ago, when the New South Wales state government changed the granny flat policy statewide in New South Wales, he went and built 3 granny flats on each of those properties. Dave's approach wasn't to get rich quick, but it was to get financially free before he was 55. Now, at the time when I met Dave, he was 53, and he had well over 6 figures of passive income already coming in. And he was working with us in Brisbane because he didn't know this market. Even though he was a very successful investor that was already financially free in Sydney, he chose to leverage off our expertise to put another house and granny flat into the market up here. Now, for Dave, his journey was simple. He simply paid off principal and interest, used the tax benefits, and used the passive income from the properties to first pay off his own home, and then once he'd done that, to slowly pay off the properties. When I met Dave, he'd bought all of these properties for under 500K in Sydney. They were all worth between 1.1 and 1.3 mil. They were all basically owned completely outright. I think he had 200 grand worth of debt left, and he was getting over $3,000 a week of income from these properties, or 150 grand a year. Because he'd also worked his entire life, he had this money in super, and he owned his own home completely outright. His kids were all but out of home basically, because he'd started the family thing a bit earlier too. And I just went, holy shit, this can work. Because at that time I already had 2 dual income properties, but I went, this is the way to do it. This is the way I'm going to do it. Because like Dave, I have a very low risk profile and a very low tolerance for the unknown. So I like to do things that give me more certainty and more security as I move forward. Now that's the example there. The second strategy, like I said, if for those of you like myself that maybe don't want to wait 15 to 20 years and want to do it in maybe 10 to 15, is buying the 2 homes, building the 2 granny flats in the accumulation phase, but then before you move into the second stage, consolidation, adding one more really high quality property near the city or on the beach near the city that you can hold and ultimately add some value to just before you sell it in the future to make a big chunk of cash. That doesn't have to be crazy. Like, one way to do it could be to buy your own home, to live in that home and add value to it over 15 years and then sell that. Take some of the money to downsize, or take some of the money to pay everything off. Another way could be just like I've done, invest in a property, hold it for a period of time and then sell it at the right time to make some money, and then take that money and rather than spend it, go and pay off some property quicker. The consolidation phase is super simple. Like I said, we still use the tax benefits, the extra rent, pay principal and interest, and use any surplus money that you have to pay off debt. But then we also have this other property with the sole intention of selling it. And one of the reasons why a lot of people don't get there sooner is because when the time comes to sell, the debt on that property that you bought to sell is low, the rental returns increase, the value is much higher, and you're never going to be able to replace it. So a lot of people that I talk to go, well, I'm not going to sell it, and that's completely fine. That's completely fine. If you want to hold everything forever, do that. But for me, again, 3.5 years ago, I decided that I would be happy to sell investments and not get emotionally attached to them anymore, so that I could bring financial freedom sooner into my personal life. That's my approach. By selling those 6 houses 3 years ago at that time, and I really ripped the band-aid off all of the assets in my portfolio that didn't make sense anymore. It's freed me so that I've been able to, raise money much faster than normal and then redistribute that money into the type of portfolio that one, makes me sleep better at night. Two, in a market like the coronavirus, which apparently, according to the Australian government, is the heaviest economic environment that we've been in since the Great Depression now. And you guys know about that. We've been talking about that for the last 6 months, exactly what's going on at the moment. And it's not a market to be scared of, but it is a market to be aware of. You know, if you're in a strong financial position, it is a potentially once in a lifetime market right now. If you're not in a strong position, then, you know, work towards strength so that you can move forward in times like this with a bit of the uncertainty that's around, you know, and then we move from that phase into freedom once you've sold that property much sooner. Now, I also wanted to show you an example of this one work. Now, this is a more theoretical example, but this is what I would do now if I could shoot back to 10 years ago from today, knowing what I now know. Let's say 10 years ago, you understood timing, you understood the Australian real estate market, you looked like I have at 250 years of American data, 350 years of European data, 100 years plus of Australian data, and you were really starting to connect the pieces. Like, I just want to say that when I first started investing in Sydney in 2011, I had no effing idea what I was doing. But now I do have a very clear idea of what I'm doing based on a insanely diligent study of history and great mentors around me that have been collectively alive for literally 1,000 years now, my mentors, in terms of their property related experience. I've sort of figured out what I would do looking back. Now, if I was looking back to buy in 2011, you know, 9-10 years ago now, I would have known that with my current knowledge that Sydney had been flat up until that point for basically 9 years. It had done an average annual growth rate of 1.5% per year. Some people say even as low as 1.2. It was this incredible long-term market that had been sitting flat for a while incomes had been growing up. We'd also just come through the second worst economic environment since the Great Depression, which they called the GFC. Now, that was a time when many people were fearful, so there were great buying opportunities around. What I would have done as someone earning 100K at that time, with my wife earning 50 grand at that time, you know, just theoretically, if I was making that money, back in 2011, I was at IBM's global graduate program earning 55K a year, but you know, let's just pretend I could have earned better money back then as well. I would have first gone out and bought one home, and I would have built a granny flat, and that would have been my first year. In the second year, I would have saved my ass off and I would have done it a second time, second home, second granny flat. And then in the third year, I would have again saved my ass off and I would have bought another property. Now, I know that right now that sounds insane because these houses in the Sutherland Shire or the northern beaches of Sydney are now worth $1 to $2 million. But at that time, I could have bought an incredible home for about the $500,000 mark, which sounds just insane now, but that's the reality of that different time. You know, maybe I would have had to pay 600K. Now, after I accumulated those properties, I literally would have started to work on paying off the debt as quickly as I possibly could through those different ideas that I told you about. And then in 2016 to 17, which I did know at that point that the market was coming to a head in Sydney and Melbourne. And as you can see, nothing's changed in those markets since then. We've actually received no meaningful growth since that point. I would have sold that first property that I bought. After a renovation, I would have sold it for at least 80 to 100% more than I paid for it. I would have taken that big chunk of cash and I would have paid off one of the houses and granny flats completely outright. And then between 2017 and 2020, I would have then worked as hard as I possibly could in paying off the debt, using all that surplus income from that property on the other property. Now, if I had have done that, it would have cost me about $1.2 million to buy those two houses and set up the two granny flats at that time. They would now be worth in the suburbs that I was looking at around about $2.5 million, and absolutely any day of the week, they'd be renting for at least $1,000 per week each, which would now give me $1,000 or $2,000 a week in the hand, $100,000 a year of income with $2.5 million worth of assets outright at age 35. Now, how simple does that sound as an example that is completely achievable? Now, unfortunately, Sydney's gone off its head. Unfortunately, in Melbourne, they don't like these granny flats or tiny homes at the moment, but that might change in the future. And so if we look at it from a timing perspective in terms of where's working, Brisbane is now at a point where it is cheaper to buy according to core logic than it was 12 years ago with inflation. Perth is cheaper to buy than it was apparently with inflation 14 years ago. Darwin has also lost 40% of its value as well. Now, I'm never going to go invest in Darwin. I might look at Perth in the future, but I'm an East Coast investor because that's where I believe the fundamental value lies in the future. So what I'm doing, knowing this information, because I can't go back to that time in Sydney with my learning today and go, this is what I do. It's so easy with retrospect to know what decisions you'd make. But moving forward, I can learn from that. And what I've done is I've set myself up with a number of high quality houses that, this year, next year, I'll add my granny flats to. Some of them already have them. And then over the next 10 years, I will work towards paying those properties off. And it is as simple as that. It doesn't have to be any harder. It's not rocket science what we're trying to do. And that's what I'm excited about to share with you guys as we move forward. So that's my how to be financially free in 15 years. For some of you, you're going to do it in 10. For some of you, you're going to do it in 7. For others, it's going to take 20 or 30 years, and that's okay. Whatever pace you want to walk through this lifetime in terms of getting your choices and financial freedom in place is 100% up to you. But I'm really excited to share this. I'm so grateful to just be a part of your life. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel or the podcast. Please give us a review if you're listening on the podcast. Thumbs up, hearts, wherever you're following this information, share it with someone that needs to see it so that you can show them that they no longer have to go out there and buy 0 to 130 properties in 3.5 years, which is the stuff that I grew up on, or 10 properties in 10 years. They can slowly and safely invest in quality assets at the right time and set yourself or your friends up, your family up for long-term financial freedom. I purely wish you all the best, stay safe, and I can't wait to connect with you soon.